All right, welcome to this first episode of Under the Hood, a new video series where we explore different perspectives on physiological data ranging from muscle oximetry to lactate, VO2, and more. So for the first episode today, we're joined by a returning guest on the channel, Jem Arnold. How you doing, Jem?
Yeah, I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. It's great to have you on for the beginning of this new series. So today, you're going to help us work through some Moxy Monitor data. So maybe for those who haven't seen our previous interactions on the channel, by the way, go check out what we did on Moxy data previously, and also the podcast that we recorded. But Jem, give us a 30-second intro on who you are, what you're doing now, and why you're going to talk to us about Moxy data.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm a PhD student at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, but I'm currently actually in the Netherlands in a research hospital in a random room that I'm sitting in right now just to do this.
Awesome.
I'm here running some research projects on a population of athletes with flow limitation of the iliac artery. So we're using NIRS quite extensively to evaluate this population. And I've done, a bunch of work on and off over the last few years with Moxy and with some of the other NIRS devices. So my shtick, my thing is kind of visualizing the data and trying to understand, interpret what's going on from a combination of visualization, and then now we're starting to get more into the statistical evaluation. So that's kind of where my experience comes from.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I look forward to going into this little discussion with you today. The goal is going to be to show as many visuals as we can, and I know you've prepared some solid slides for us to look at. So let's start with the foundation of this conversation. Where did it start? We were talking, you and I, about different profiles that seem to emerge from Moxy data when we collect data on intermittent tests ranging kind of the full spectrum, moderate, heavy, severe intensities. We're talking specifically about cycling here today. We might branch off into running just for some comparisons, but maybe set up the stage for us and tell us what we're going to be looking at and why we got to that point of discussion to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. So make a long story relatively short, as my lights are going down in the room here right now. Most of the NIRS literature, certainly most sports science literature, everyone's kind of familiar with a ramp test, VO2 max test, and a lot of the NIRS literature comes from that. But it may not be the best test to evaluate NIRS, to evaluate oxygenation in peripheral muscle, just because it's a very quick test and there's no time for the oxygenation to kind of come to a steady state. So that is the rationale behind we've been using, and again, Moxy and Jörg Feldman and others have developed an intermittent multi-stage protocol where we have anywhere 3 to 5 minutes or longer at a constant workload. So there's enough time to get to steady state, just like you would do with lactate. And then you take a 1 minute rest, and then you progress to the next stage. And so we're observing just the oxygenation within each work stage as workload increases, as intensity increases. And then we're kind of observing how is just the overall trend across intensity from low to high. And that's really kind of where there's some interesting features. And it's probably important to say, I think most of our experiences with Moxy, I've used some other sensors as well, but the data we'll be looking at today comes from Moxy. Every sensor is going to have slight differences. And so the physiology is the same, but it's more of the what is the data and what is the actual interpretation of it. So let's say this. Of course, there's a spectrum, just like anything. There's kind of a spectrum of responses, but let's say the two extremes or the two ends of that spectrum are typified by. We're going back and forth right now on the language we should be using here, but we can kind of say a more linear response, which is to say, as workload increases, SmO2, oxygen saturation, tends to decrease, fairly straightforward. And then the other profile is a bit more curvilinear, where at lower workloads, as the power is increasing step to step, we'll actually see a net increase in oxygenation, increase in saturation, before kind of plateauing and then declining towards the end. So we've been calling those, linear and curvilinear, or monotonic and non-monotonic, or parabolic. Like there's a bunch of different ways, but we're just trying to understand, and it will make, of course, a lot more sense with the visuals.
Yeah. So
I could pull up the first chart here.
Yeah. Why don't you share that? And so just to be clear here, we're trying to advance the conversation on all those topics. So for anybody who has an input, whether it's informed or not, you can work from first principles. You can have some previous experience with, you know, data that you've collected or research that you've seen. Please leave us a comment below. We'll be looking forward to reading your inputs on what we're trying to share here. And if you have any ideas why we see those two different presentations or profiles in the SmO2 trends, fire away, because we're still, we have a couple hunches, but we're still in the guessing stages. But I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, all of the different ways NIRS is being used right now in the field is super important to kind of understand how it applies. And so if we're seeing similarities, if we're seeing differences, it's all very, very useful to understand. So you should be seeing, well, the front page of a slide. This is going to be a presentation that I give at another point, but we're getting the demo version. We're getting the early sneak preview right now.
Sweet.
Let's see, can I, yeah, there we go. So this started the other day. So yeah, so this is a post you put up. Again, we had this question about, can we take someone who has this linear response, which again, we'll clarify what that means in a moment, but can we take someone like Sean who has a linear response and can we make it look curvilinear? And so we're doing some experimenting right now. And I've got another, test I want you to try next opportunity you have. But for this one, we just had you start at a super low workload, like basically as low as the bike would allow you to go. And we got something that looked like this out of it. So this is coming from the right VL in blue. We'll look at the left VL as well later, but just to kind of simplify it. So you can imagine each stage here is at an increasing power and increasing workload from, what do we start at? 50 watts, I think.
So start at 50 watts, and it was a plus 25 watt on each stage. So 4 minutes on, 1 minute off, all the way to, I think I finished 275. And that's right around my critical power. So I thought I would cut it there for the day.
Yeah, exactly. A little bit of more than enough. It's a nice long test.
Yeah, I didn't go much further than that.
So again, as we see here, we can probably already start to tell, like if you kind of just ran a line through the work across all of the work outputs, it's fairly linear. There's no obvious, no one stage is any higher than the last stage. And so that's what I mean when I say monotonic. I mean basically monotonic decreasing in this case. It just means at no point does it increase. It only ever decreases, not necessarily linearly, but it only ever decreases. And of course, if we really look at kind of the early stages, there's a little bit of increase within that stage. But again, looking from between these stages, and I'll make this more clear in a moment, that's where we mean it's pretty much just going straight down. So as power goes up, saturation goes down. And that's the linear or the monotonic profile. The curvilinear profile would look something, and I'll just kind of estimate here, it would look something more like that, where there's a very clear increase in saturation at lower workloads. So if our experiment, if our hypothesis was, if we start at a much lower power output, can we make you look parabolic or curvilinear? I think the answer was no. So we have to, we'll see.
And maybe
let's just, go ahead.
To add to this, what I had seen up until now, collecting those data on different populations, different type of athletes, different modalities, is I like you said, seen those two trends. Let's call them linear and parabolic for simplicity for now, until somebody comes up with a better nomenclature. And what I had seen is kind of this flat trend across intensity domains for the linear profile, which we kind of see here. And had I gone farther than 275 at 300 and 325, we most likely would have seen that this SmO2 minimum would have stayed around there, or at least it would have stopped. The rate of decrease of SmO2 as power increases would have lowered greatly. And then on a parabolic profile, I would usually see a increasing in the moderate intensity domain, flat in the heavy intensity domain, and then heavily descending in the severe intensity domain. And so that, but then, like you said, well, maybe if you start lower, we'll see the parabolic into the flat at the end, which, like you said, that was the hypothesis, but it was not the case.
Like the theory would be, if we took this curvilinear athlete and we started them at that workload, well, they would then look linear. So the question is, okay, for those of us who look linear, and I'm the same way, I look linear as well, and we can talk about some of these speculations why we think an athlete would show one or the other. but basically, if we started us at a lower intensity, would we show this early increase in saturation? And no, at least not with this work period. And that's kind of a hint of what I want to try next is if we extend those work periods, maybe at this low intensity, maybe that's enough where we actually see some increase, but that'll be yet to be determined.
Yeah.
So for the plateau at the bottom, for the plateau at the bottom, I think that's valuable we can look at your left leg because it was a slightly different response. So we can kind of go through, this is just showing, right, this is the trend that we've talked about, right? It's not perfectly linear, but it's constantly decreasing. We can look at the peaks as well, but we'll maybe leave that aside for now. And then we can look at the left leg. So the left VL is in pink. And you have an injury history there. I don't know how much we need to go into that, but feel free to share whatever you want.
There definitely seems to be maybe a 20-watt difference between my left and my right leg, and I've seen that consistently. So far, I haven't been able to acquire pedals to look at left to right differences in power output, but I have seen on pretty much all the data that I've collected on myself via Moxy that there is a significant difference between the left and the right. And it seems, maybe to get to the point that we were going to, it seems like the left leg reaches this lower plateau, this minimum plateau, one step earlier than the right, which again matches what I've seen so far at different intensities and in different conditions.
That's exactly where we're going here. You can see it kind of the sharper drop happens one stage earlier in the left. It's a very clear example. It's almost like you could shift the left leg by one stage and then it would match up more closely. And then of course, we're almost at zero. I should explain the chart actually before I go further. Of course, we're looking at time on the x-axis just across the entire stage, and we have SmO2 oxygen saturation, muscle oxygen saturation from the Moxy from 0 to 100%. So of course, as you're approaching zero, there's kind of nowhere to go. So almost by definition, at that point, there has to be kind of a plateau, a decrease in the rate of deoxygenation. But the fact that it's happening at one stage earlier in the left is interesting, certainly meaningful. But that's probably another conversation that we can have about differences.
Absolutely.
But in terms of the trend, I think in terms of the general trend, and it's a little bit busy now here. But if we're just looking at the work, it's similar. Again, maybe shifted by one in terms of intensity, but it's similar. Maybe an important thing to note here, as we were talking before about lactate measurements as well, and this kind of protocol, this step test protocol would be very common to measure lactate. I would assume my assumption would be that whatever the lagging leg, that's an awkward way to say it, but basically the weaker leg, the leg that is having to work harder and is probably working at a higher relative intensity and is therefore having a more disrupted metabolic milieu and contributing all those metabolites systemically, the weaker leg will probably determine or contribute more to all of these systemic measures. So if we're taking blood lactate, that's a systemic measure that's coming from the entire body. The net accumulation rate, net of production at the legs and oxidation everywhere else. And even respiration will be affected by all of those metabolites from the weaker leg. So there's certainly some interesting kind of aspects here of how well any single muscle breakpoint or any single muscle profile, let's say, corresponds to systemic breakpoints and profiles. But again, that's maybe a longer conversation for another time.
Yeah, and I'll throw something in the ring just for argument's sake, because I think it matches what you're saying here. Evan was telling me about some work that he's done on critical power correlation with the reoxy slopes. And obviously they first did that in a forearm occluded setting. So it was kind of a local setting, and those things seem to match up really well. So essentially peak reoxy with the Moxy seemed to be really close. Yeah, right there. Peak reoxy seemed to correlate really, really well with critical power in that I guess forearm, because that's what they were measuring. But then when you went to the systemic level, there was compensated, they call them not compensated and non-compensators, where sometimes the stronger leg would be predictive from a critical power standpoint or critical oxygenation standpoint, and sometimes the weaker leg would be predictive. And so
interesting.
So they kind of split, I think, if I remember correctly, and I'm trying not to botch this, they had two different profiles, some with the weaker leg, some with the stronger leg. up until now, I haven't had a reply, and I don't know if they've been able to move forward on that and determine exactly the why and the how. But that was just to your previous point. We'll just leave it there, and people can maybe dig a little further on this. Right. Let's move forward from here.
All of this is just interesting little teasers. I want to comment maybe now that we're talking about other muscles, forearm muscles. So let's kind of just simplify the image here. So we're back to our, monotonic or our linear profile coming from your good leg, your stronger leg. An interesting aspect of, again, why some of the reasons we think this curvilinear is happening, and we'll get into it now. Of course, the speculation is it something related to fitness? Is it something related to the tissue composition of the muscle and of the tissue under the sensor, right? So kind of just athlete characteristics. We tested the question of, is it just relative workload and relative intensity? And at least in this anecdote, in this example, it did not seem to correspond to that. So some of these reasons, what's going on? Why would one athlete show this curvilinear, this parabolic profile? An interesting aspect that I want to raise here is, we see this profile quite commonly elsewhere at other muscles, at non-involved or non-priority or non-locomotor muscles. So for instance, I know they weren't doing the test on the forearm during cycling. It was just a local test. But if we had a sensor on your bicep, your shoulder, your forearm, whatever, during cycling, of course, that's a non-locomotor muscle site. And it's going to show a profile that is something related to this. It might actually be more kind of start higher and flat, but it's that curvilinear shape. So here's an interesting thing, is like, okay, is there something in common between a non-locomotor, let's say a deltoid, and a VL, which is clearly a working muscle, but in an athlete who shows a curvilinear response? And my PhD supervisor, bright guy that he is, had an interesting idea that it's worth kind of discussing or thinking about, is maybe this profile is just related to non-priority tissue. So the deltoid, very clearly, this is our deltoid response, delt, is a non-priority tissue. And so at low intensities, not much is happening. At higher intensities, maybe it's just a matter of redistributing blood flow to the working muscles, to the legs. Maybe it's a matter of there is going to be more recruitment in that tissue, of course, as to stabilize the effort. But maybe this curvilinear response is a non-priority tissue response. And then if we think, okay, what's going on in the VL? Maybe it means that signal that we're getting is coming from more non-priority tissue. So that could be the skin layers, which we know is going to saturate with blood flow for thermoregulation. It could be coming from the fat layer under the tissue, under the skin, between the muscle. Interestingly, it could be coming from the muscle itself. And of course, we know different fiber typologies are going to have kind of different balances of blood flow, blood volume, oxygenation at low and high intensities. So it doesn't get us closer to kind of mechanistically explaining this, but I think it was an interesting way to think about it, is the signal is kind of a non-priority tissue signal. That could be an interesting way to kind of frame it.
Yeah, that's interesting. However, I have seen this profile on VLs in cycling on certain people, as have you, and I've seen it in. I haven't done as many tests running as I have on the bike, but I have seen. I would probably say the majority of the people that I've tested running and with a Moxy on their rectus femoris, I actually see that profile as well, the parabolic or curvilinear
more
profile.
Curvilinear. Yeah.
And to my knowledge,
well, even in cycling.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's not a non-involved muscle or a secondary muscle.
True.
It's a primary one. And again, even a VL in cycling. So what do you think about that?
Well, that's the question. It's like, is it the VL in cycling that we're getting, or is it, again, like the layers above the VL? The RF in cycling, it's a quadricep, but it has a different recruitment profile, or kind of different recruitment profile than VL. So there's the same kind of thing. Like the EMG actually from RF would look something like that. So it's kind of a curvilinear, whereas VL is a little bit more linear with workload. So anyways, there's certainly some, like, we really have to explore this and think about, okay, what muscles are we seeing that and when, and across modalities as well, as you say, between running, cycling, throw rowing in there for the upper body, right?
Yeah, we'll keep the adipose layer thickness for after, because you have a couple slides on that, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's basically where we're going into right now. So that's kind of what I wanted to get to.
Okay.
So
I'll let you follow what you were going to say next.
Yeah. The beautiful, we're on the right track here. So these data come from a study that we performed at UBC last summer. So all of the individual lines here you can see is all of our different subjects. We have 21 subjects, 11 males, 10 females, different fitness levels, but they're all trained cyclists, and this is a cycling test. And they're each performing 2 trials, actually. So we have 2 trials from every athlete, so about 42 trials. And we have NIRS here on the left and the right. VL, it's still the VL. We've changed the plot a little bit, so I just want to go through it. Relative workload on the bottom. So we've been looking at time series data, basically, right? So we've been looking at time on the x-axis from your data here, Sean. What we've done for the larger group, because it's such a large group size that we're evaluating, is we basically take, the mean value of each of these stages, and we parameterize it as a single value. And so we're taking now, instead of on time, we're taking it on relative to every athlete's watt peak from their last stage. So of course, everyone reaches 100% by definition at their last stage. So we've normalized it because all of these different athletes are reaching different number of stages, different power outputs, different watts per kg, all of that kind of stuff. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So we're looking at it in terms of relative workload from, again, the first stage will be down here somewhere at 20. The last stage, of course, will be at 100.
Yeah, and you can. What sticks out to me is that there's all those curvilinear ones on top of the trend, and then there's all those linear ones underneath.
Yes, good spot. Well spotted. We'll clean that up. I mean, just for starters here, if we look at across our entire group size and we just compare left to right, because we saw some left-right differences in yourself, we could see marginal difference in magnitude, but certainly not significant. And the trend is exactly the same. So at a broad level, there's no differences. We would not expect any differences left to right. So when we see differences left to right, like in yourself, maybe that's worth following up. This is now we've separated same data. Now we've separated it into this phenotype or this response profile. So this is just us visually looking at each trial and allocating it to either, what are my names here, curvilinear or monotonic. So it's all a priori. And we say, is there a difference between those 2 stages? Well, yes, of course there is. We can see that visually. And we've kind of, again, we've said there is a priori. But as you say, you can see all kind of the more linear profiles are down here, and then the more curvilinear are up there. So I think this is probably the best visualization we have right now of again, we can think of this as a spectrum, and you can see the extent of variability across the entire group is massive. So you're going to see variability in this profile, depends on your athlete. But and this is kind of how we would typify these 2 responses.
Yeah, as a first takeaway here, I think even though we don't have a very good explanation yet on why there is a difference, I think it is important that we note that there is a difference and that people realize that there is. And when they're looking at Moxy or other NIRS device trend, they might see one of either of those profiles. And if you're looking for one, consistent response in every muscle group all the time, you might get taken aback by seeing those 2 different profiles. And it took me, 20, 30 tests of just looking at the whole thing and saying, okay, they're really, those 2 things are emerging. I don't have a rationale for them yet, but I have to know that there's those 2 profiles out there. So I can kind of, off the bat, I can now kind of determine where it's going to go and what it's going to probably look like down the road. But it's important to note that.
If we're your interpretation of, I don't know what 40% means to this athlete versus what 40% means to this athlete is a very different interpretation. So it really is important to understand, okay, what does that athlete look like across intensity, and kind of where they fall in this, in this spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we can kind of briefly go through maybe, again, some of the aspects that we think might be contributing to this. And I think the first most important, I hope I have it next, yes, is the difference of sex. So we had approximately equal number of male and female, and it came down. I mean, you could see that the difference in the profile, it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Not every female had a curvilinear,
Yeah.
and not every male had linear.
Yeah.
But pretty close, and it was a very high explanatory
And
value of sex.
Yeah, anecdotally, that's also what I've seen in my testing, is that most females that I've tested have a more of a curvilinear profile, whereas most men have a linear profile. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of confounding variables there, like just the fact of fitness levels and training status will be different between male and female. This peak, or at any stage, right? At any stage, the absolute watts is going to be much lower, tend to be much lower in females. Even the watts per kg will tend to be lower in females. So there's a lot of confounding factors that we have to pick apart. I think one of the most meaningful is the effect of skin fold tissue thickness or adipose tissue thickness. Females, even super lean, super fit females, are going to have more fat tissue distributed on their quadriceps than males of kind of the equivalent fitness level. So we're looking at the effect of sex here. If we look at the effect of skin fold thickness, and now the colors have actually shifted, so it's a little bit confusing, but we basically have females tend to show a curvilinear response.
Yep.
And if we look at high skin fold, again, that tends to be a curvilinear response.
Wow. So that does actually match up what we were looking at. Can we talk about the red signal that you were showing me the other day? Is that okay to talk about?
Absolutely. Yeah. Which one was that?
That was
totally.
that was the two different depths of signal.
And yes.
It looked like the deeper signal was more of a linear response, whereas the more superficial signal depth penetration was more curvilinear. So that kind of explains that.
Yeah. So to go into that, we're using another NIRS sensor right now, Train Red. It's based on the Artinus Portamon, which people may be familiar with. That's been around for a long time. It's in a lot of the literature. It has more options for penetration depth of the signal. So we can pick apart this channel coming from the most superficial, which is I think 10 millimeters, and we can pull out the deepest channel, which is 40 millimeters. And so what you were talking about is, yeah, when I should have brought those data here, but when I showed the superficial channel, it looked a lot more curvilinear. It wasn't exactly this, but it was a curvilinear response. And the deepest channel, which we would guess is more into the muscle, had a more linear response. And so this is kind of saying the same thing, where if there's high adiposity, high thickness of tissue above the muscle, as I said before, more of that signal is going to be responding to that non-involved, that non-metabolically active tissue. And we seem to get a profile like that. As we reduce that tissue thickness and we're getting more depth of the signal coming from the muscle, that seems to respond with a more linear response. So, and this is not categorical or binary. It's a range. I think our range
spectrum,
was,
right?
Yeah, 4 millimeters to 17, which is quite high, but across that range we can kind of see the spread here.
Yeah, very interesting.
But again, confounded with sex, number one. So there's other stuff going on here. But as a kind of an Occam's razor, lowest hanging fruit, I have to say this has a lot of explanatory value.
Yeah.
But I really, and we've talked about this. Okay, this seems to make sense. Let's step back and challenge it now, and let's try to prove ourselves wrong here, and see how we can falsify this.
Yeah. So remind me what the next experiment was for that. Was it all non-involved while cycling?
Well, there's a few different, lots of experiments in my head,
but, let's follow up on that afterwards.
Duration. Yeah. Like effects of duration, effects of different muscles, even proximal and distal on the same muscle, on the same VL. That's a good way to look at the same muscle with different adiposity. So there's a few things that we can do. I want to share this one. This is kind of neat. So now we're just looking at the males, which tend to be the linear responders, because you're male, you're linear responders. Let's look at that subgroup. And now I want to know, is there any effect of fitness on this signal? If we kept the entire group here, again, we wouldn't see this trend, because sex, skin fold, tissue, fitness, it's all interrelated. So let's just isolate to this linear profile group. And do we see a meaningful and a statistically significant effect of fitness as VO2 peak in mils per minute per kg? Statistically, no, there's no difference. Visually, is there a meaningful difference? Interesting. It seems like the difference in fitness, so again, we have high fitness is in red on the top here. High fitness tends to start at a higher saturation. That's interesting. Lower fitness at a lower, but they end up at exactly the same point. So this is kind of the population trend, what we would expect the effect of fitness. So is that meaningful? Is that about maybe a 10 or 15% difference at the lowest intensity? But by the end, they're at the same point. So
do you have substrate oxidation rates for those subjects?
I do. Yes. All of these subjects had lactate measurements and gas exchange, and I have all of those data waiting to be put into this model.
One thing that comes to mind now for me is at those lower intensities is SmO2 max and the relationship with fat oxidation capabilities.
Yeah,
because we
absolutely.
I mean, off the top, just thinking from first principles, high fitness individuals are more likely to have higher fat oxidation capabilities.
Yep.
And that's the one thing I'm citing now, because it's just on my mind, is the link between oxymyoglobin and free fatty acid transport and utilization. And if you have more oxygen available and your myoglobin is more saturated, it seems to be more likely to transport those free fatty acids for utilization. So I don't know if there's a link there, but that would be really interesting to look at down the line, maybe.
Yeah. There's those metabolic differences, but then there's just the structural tissue muscle fiber composition differences. Yeah, there's a lot we can go here. And again,
that's a really cool graph, by the way. I like this one.
This is such a preliminary finding, but we've talked about this. I really like the visuals. I think it's very important. Just understanding that this trend is going on comes from the visuals. And now we can investigate that line of thought further.
Great. We got 6 minutes left, Jem. What are we doing with the rest of the time?
What's next? Well, do you think we have time? We can skip all that and we can look at some of the work SmO2 slope stuff.
Actually, why don't we go back and look at the other couple graphs that you had on the same line of thinking, and then we can maybe take another. Yeah, we look at the slopes another time because we're going to be, otherwise we're going to be short here.
Never enough time on these.
No, and I think it's good for that series to try to keep it to one or two topics, so that people can bite size it and not get too overwhelmed by what we talk about.
Yes, yeah, very much so. Get excited. Okay, so this power deoxygenation ratio, it can be super simple, but I think it's important because what we're talking about here is, we see this general response profile, and we've just added power. So it's actually simulated, right? Because I didn't have your power data, but we had power stages that looked something like this. Yeah. So we can say, okay, the NIRS signal, the saturation signal, is doing that. What does that mean? But also, of course, we have a workload. And that workload is changing over time. So we can almost think of this like a delta efficiency for a given change in power, because the change here is 25 watts and the change here is 25 watts. But maybe the difference between stages, certainly between like this stage and that stage, is suddenly more different than this stage and that stage for the same increase in power. So what's going on there? Why do we have a different response at the same increase in workload? And of course, we start thinking, metabolic intensity, right? All of these metabolic breakpoints. What we can do is just think about this as a ratio of how much power is one leg able to produce relative to how much deoxygenation is incurring in that leg. Basically, how much disruption to the metabolic milieu does that leg incur to produce that power? And so it's a ratio of essentially, let's split it in half and we'll just look at the right leg. So the right leg's producing 50-50, let's say, and it's taking approximately this much volume, the area above the curve of saturation signal to produce that power. And so we can run just a simple ratio, and we get something that looks like this. And I've left the units out because they're not important, but we're just looking at a ratio. How much power is the leg producing relative to how much deoxygenation is incurred in that leg? So we can see this is where we get into some of the differences between left and right. And again, let's parameterize this and make it a little bit cleaner. And now it's the exact same plot, but we're just looking at number of stages. And so here's where we start to see your saturation was linear, but relative to the workload, relative to the change in workload, it's more of this curvilinear response, and almost even reaching a maximum somewhere in this, stage 6, 7 in the right leg. The left leg is doing something different.
It is.
And that's where we kind of have to think about.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'd never actually plotted it like that. So it's interesting. What comes to your mind off the bat looking at those?
Yeah, I like, very simply speaking, we would say this kind of or let's say an increase in the power deoxygenation ratio can come from kind of a combination. You know, it could be either or it could be both, but it's basically either more power being produced for less oxygen, as simple as that, or simply more of that power that's coming out is being produced from non-oxidative sources. Okay. And we can't know, certainly not by looking at these data. We can probably look at some of the gas exchange and have a better estimate on that. But it's some proportion of, you know, it's some contribution of that. So if we know there's an injury history, if we know there's a tissue quality difference, we would probably say in this case, yeah, the right is higher because it's having a better time of producing power. And it probably means actually, if more power is coming out for the same deoxygenation, it probably means there's a better supply of oxygen, which is able to maintain a higher flux, energy in, energy out, you know, oxygen in, magic happens, not to get into it, and then external workload is produced. Yeah. So that's happening at a higher rate in the right leg versus the left. The fact that it reaches a maximum, I'm not sure. I'd be interested to hear other interpretations, but I wonder in this case again if it's really, you know, if there's a compensation here for the other leg, which is lagging, which is the weaker leg, and it's kind of, you know, it's doing everything it can, and then it's kind of it's also getting to its maximum. So something related to that, but it's kind of an experimental little parameter that we've been looking at.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd be interested in the future to maybe see some similar data from other subjects you've tested to see if we see maybe less of that imbalance, and maybe off the top of my head like this, would that maybe be an indicator to look at for at for imbalances? That's, I don't know if you think that might be valuable.
I can't say for sure yet, but it's one of the parameters that we're interested in looking at. And again, it's kind of this very gross, very crude approximation of you know, a peripheral efficiency, how much power is coming out, how much deoxygenation is required to produce that power. But it's something interesting, and I think it's a worthwhile way to analyze some of these data to normalize for a change in power, just like you would do in a VO2 test to look at, again, delta efficiency or some of the other efficiency values.
All right, well, Jem, we're getting to the end of our little chat here, so I wanted to maybe just go over a little summary of what we looked at and what you've kind of what you concluded from the data that we collected here and what we were able to see, and maybe talk about that, you know, future steps of investigation that we want to conduct and that I'm going to be doing on the bike, so that we can get the next set of data to look at. And like I said, we didn't get time to look at everything that you had. We tried to keep it short, but those things always
there will always be more to look at.
Exactly. So we'll be looking at some SmO2 slopes next time. But yeah, maybe give us a little summary of what we looked at, what you took away from it, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, for me, the really interesting kind of empirical finding here is this tendency towards one of two profiles: curvilinear, parabolic, or linear monotonic, something like that. And then there's a lot of variability within individuals in between. The big question is then, where is that profile? Where are those profiles coming from? And that's really what we want to understand. And again, the data that I showed, it looks like there's an effect of sex. And that's there is so much going on there, of course, that first of all, it probably means that we need to be testing more females and males of kind of equivalent fitness levels, you know, trying to match for, I would say, competitive level, training history, and fitness status being different but related things. So trying to normalize across those, and then understanding, okay, where do we see this profile? Does it appear? Does it not appear? There's lots of kind of testing that we need to do to falsify the hypothesis that this is related to skin fold tissue thickness. But right now, that seems to be the most explanatory variable that I've seen. But there are so many good reasons to think it is not, certainly not exclusively. I don't think it's exclusively skin fold thickness. But again, it seems that skin fold is explaining a lot of that variability. So we need to do some testing to control for all of these parameters and really kind of experiment. So what I'm thinking, again, kind of off the top of my head, to really, for us, both of us, to be testing, and others as well. Like the more data we can look at, the better. So we look at the effect of starting workload as number one. That's what we just did. I want to look at the effect of duration of each stage. How long do you actually give your body to come to a steady state at that particular workload, at that energetic demand? Even steps between stages. Like 25 watts, 50 watts, steps between stages. And doing some other testing, like comparing the effect of cadence. So can we kind of manipulate some of these variables between oxygen delivery and oxygen extraction? And cadence is a good way to do that, not to go too much into detail, but there's like the next couple months of testing for us to do.
Okay.
So yeah, that's kind of where I leave it at. I don't know, where do you think? What's your input at this?
Yeah, I really like that you've been able to go a little farther on determining why those two profiles appear. At least we have some ideas of where that can come from. And so that maybe gives some tools or some ideas for other people to go in and look at those data.
Very much.
Again, for anybody watching this or listening, please leave a comment below. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you have similar experiences, different experiences, because we're open to anything here. The goal is really to just kind of share what we learned along the way and all move in the same direction, at least upwards, wherever that direction might be. So Jem, thanks so much for coming on for this first Under the Hood episode. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sean.
And I look forward to doing the next ones. I think, like you said, the duration is going to be one to look at, because maybe if I write long enough at 50 watts, we will see a significant increase in SmO2, maybe the same at 100, probably not the same at 200. So that'll be probably the next one that I get on. Like I said, looking forward to look at some of the SmO2 slopes as well that we talked about that we didn't have time to look at. But I think that's a great starting point. And I hope people share it far and wide, people comment, people try to interact and bring their own, data and interpretation and ideas. Thanks so much, man.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Sean.
Where can people find you if they want to interact? You've started. I've managed to push you a little bit.
You got me on Twitter. I don't even know what my username on Twitter is right now. Probably Jem Arnold. I mean, JEM. There's not many of us out there. Spare Cycles is my blog that I occasionally post to, and I have an email there. I think my email was on the front slide, my UBC email, so I'm happy to answer. And like you said, I'm really interested to see what else is out there, if people have different theories for the same thing, or if people are seeing something totally different. I'm really curious to see all of that, so please reach out.
Fantastic, man. Well, looking forward to the next one. Until then, mate. Safe research, and send me that next protocol that I have to do via WhatsApp, and I'll get on it. I'll get on it.
Good stuff.
All right. See you, Jem. Talk to you soon.
See you later. Yep.